who runs the Institute for Teaching and Learning, and you two put this together?
We did.
So the Rethinking Gender series, which was created by the Institute for Teaching and Learning and Women's Studies, and I'm standing in for Kathy because she can't be here today, introducing Dr. Susan Ramlo, who is going to be speaking to us, but things you might want to know about her because it makes it kind of fun to listen to the process. A little bit will get given away there. She is a professor of general technology, specifically physics. She actually got her PhD in education here at the University of Akron and her master's in physics at Miami, and actually did her undergraduate degree at Mount Union.
That's right.
Ohio Central here.
Yes, no matter how hard I try to leave, I'm always stuck in Ohio.
But in addition to being a physicist, Susan is really dedicated to education, broadly speaking, and has done an amazing amount of work, both as an academic, a scholar focused on something called Q methodology, which I don't know if you'll address all today.
I can't talk about that.
I highly recommend the Q methodology workshop. It was fascinating. But also focuses on, I actually have to get the S's right, the scientific study of subjectivity, which, if that is intriguing at all, you should ask her more about that. But today we're going to be hearing about issues of gender and race and standardized test evaluation. So for the students who are in the room from my part of the world, my class, really be listening to what she has to say about dimensions of difference and how we can actually study.
Well, thank you so much. Wow, I'm going to sign you up for all of my introductions. All right, so just like Carolyn said, and hopefully this is recording. There we go. So I thought I'd start off talking about my outline a little bit. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an overview about student evaluation of teaching, not that we don't know what it is. Issues in general with Likert scale surveys, natural biases, I guess you could call it natural, in student evaluation of teaching, talk about some alternative measures that I've used, and then we'll kind of wrap it up with audience feedback, kind of maybe what insights you found from student evaluation of teaching, alternatives that you use, maybe either in your classroom or for retention, tenure, and promotion and merit documents, and then that should be the link that I posted to. So, and like I said, hopefully it's recording. It's only the second time I've actually used this software. So, all right. So, we're all familiar with standard student evaluation of teaching, right? It's a Likert scale. It's usually, most strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? And 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree, unless you're in the College of Education, in which case they have it reversed, at least with their current one, the last time I taught in the College of Ed. They're usually bubble sheets, like we see pictured here. Usually it's summative, so it's at the very end of the semester, too late to do anything about it. And students provide their responses, supposedly based on their very thoughtful opinions. And they're almost always quantitative, meaning that you get some mean value either overall for all of the questions or per question or both. And sometimes there's qualitative comments depending on what college you're in and whether or not you have that as an option. But of course then the question is, what does it all mean? And this has been something that has actually bugged me for a really long time, including, I'll tell you a short story, when I was in graduate school and we had a horrible person who taught, everybody's favorite class, advanced mathematical physics, and we gave him a horrible evaluation mid-semester because he was up for RTP, and they gave him tenure. And I thought, well, what does this mean then? Because we're giving him this input, we're giving it to the department, and they're obviously not doing anything with it. And so those questions have bothered me. Now I'm in my 21st year here at the university. So some issues just with Likert scale questionnaires, right? So we know about these, right? We say we have 2 people, right? And they both respond the same way. They both give you a 4 for, being knowledgeable in your field, like some freshman knows whether or not you're knowledgeable about the physics field. And but what does it mean, right? Do they mean the same thing just because they gave you the same number? Or do those numbers mean different things to different people, right? So we could do an example, right? So maybe, right, we have somebody says, I agree strongly that I enjoyed this course. And then somebody else, right, says that they moderately agree with I enjoyed this course. They could mean the same thing, and they could mean different things, right? So a way around that is to ask kind of almost what's an ifsative question, but it's not really ifsative in Q, but that's okay. Which is, do you prefer something over something else? So I would rather ride my bike, right, than play baseball. At least then we know about that relationship of A to B in a different way than we know about two different people responding to a number on a Likert scale. Right? So some general student evaluation of teaching issues, right? And we kind of know these things, right? They are very high stakes. They influence retention, tenure, and promotion decisions and merit. Even at the distinguished professor level, I was on a committee and, how are we evaluating this guy in mechanical engineering, whether or not he's a good teacher? We have stacks of student evaluation of teaching. And to me, of course, then I already felt uncomfortable because I don't believe them. Because we assume that they're a valid measure of teaching effectiveness. But there's lots and lots of literature that says that that's not true. Back in 2003, 11 years ago, the National Research Council actually denounced the use of student evaluation of teaching and said that it was not an effective measure. There are some inherent biases, especially if you teach in STEM fields where women and minorities are a minority. So sex and race can negatively impact your student evaluation of teaching scores, whether or not the students perceive the course as difficult, and their expected course grade. So what happens, right, is that instructors influence the results. Sometimes when I was in the retention champions meeting, there was a grad student and undergrad are on this team, and I gave a shameless plug for this talk, and I said, well, instructors try to, I'll talk about a lot of things, including instructors influencing student evaluation of teaching, and he turned to me and he said, oh, you mean like we're not going to have a final, we're going to have a pizza party instead? And I said, yes, that. And all kinds of other things, right? Other things are whether or not the instruments are valid or reliable. I can guarantee you that in my college, and probably all of your colleges, nobody ever did, right, psychometrics on that SET that we base so much on, right? They're probably not valid. They could be reliable, right, so consistency of measure, but they're probably not actually measuring, right, quality of teaching, and that's validity. And they're also not very useful if you're trying to get useful student feedback to change your course to make it better, right? They don't really give you much feedback. And that's true if you use the college-produced document like we have right now in CAST, or when I first came here, we used some massively produced, supposedly normed test that we got from, I want to say it was like the University of Indiana. And it was the same. People sat me down when I was a little newbie and taught me what boxes to check so that my evaluation scores would go up, right? Because it was all relative, because it was normed. And then the idea that there are multiple voices, right? Because we have a class, just because they're all sitting in our class doesn't mean they feel the same about us or the coursework or everything in it. And Likert scale SETs kind of have that natural assumption, right? There's all kinds of statistical issues related to that, and I'm not going to scare anybody really with talking statistics, right? But there's all kinds of problems. One is that if you plot most evaluations, whether they're student evaluation of teaching or department chair evaluations or anything, they're almost never a normal distribution like this, which is where the mean, median, and mode happen in the same part, right? So you can use all of them interchangeably to give you the same number. They're almost always skewed, right? Either, right, one way or the other. And that means mean, median, and mode are not the same. It means that the mean is inappropriate. To make it even more complicated, it doesn't make any sense statistically because the numbers we're using are not continuous variables, right? They're not variables that we use to measure like temperature or height or weight. They're categorical, ordinal categorical variables. They're labels, right? Which means that it's also inappropriate to report means. Baldwin and Blattner gave a good summary and did some additional research about biases in and things that affect student evaluation and teaching scores, time of the day the course is offered, students' GPA, the course level, 100, 200, 300, the class size, the students' interest in the subject area. So that means for those of us who teach Gen Ed, we're probably at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to people who are teaching, right? So if it's an anthropology student and they're in a 400 level class, they're probably much more engaged than if it's a general education class. And then, of course, kind of the whole idea of this talk is that there are all kinds of gender and gender-related issues in student evaluation and teaching, and that overall, being a professor is considered a male occupation by many, including students, right? And even, right, so females, there's been a ton of these, where female instructors almost always get rated lower by male students than they rate their male instructors. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. Some of it is perceived role models and perceived gender roles. And there's been, like I said, a lot of different research, even going back to 1959. So student evaluation of teaching, that idea initiated in the 1920s. And it didn't take long for people to figure out that they were biased. And so we even have back in 1959 an article about, right, all of the issues related to student evaluation of teaching. And, in 1999, Abrami and D. Apollonia, right, reiterate past concerns or current concerns. Then Baldwin and Blattner, who I just had up there, right, guarding against potential bias in student evaluations. There was recently an article on National Public Radio's website about student course evaluations get an F, and, right, some more of those kinds of things. And that NPR piece, right, Stark and, oh no, this is the other people. These are the two guys from Berkeley. Freshstat is basically Becky's equivalent, so he's from their Institute for Teaching and Learning, and Stark is a statistics professor, and they're both at Berkeley. And they also wrote a paper that talked about statistical issues related to student evaluation of teaching, and as well as biases that influence and the happy things faculty do to improve their student evaluation of teaching, because they're high stakes. And so one of the things that they called for is other ways of looking at evaluation of teaching, and they talked a lot about changing policies, and they've implemented new policies at Berkeley to address some of these kinds of concerns. So what are we going to do about all of this? And so there's all kinds of alternatives. In the RTP guidelines in my department, we encourage faculty not to rely on student evaluation of teaching. We actually list a number of alternatives that they should use to supplement, since we're mandated to use student evaluation of teaching instruments both fall, spring, and summer, whether or not you're tenured or not, which didn't used to be the case. It used to be that once you got tenure, you only had to be evaluated one semester a year. So we often encourage using your own questionnaires, whether that's to target the student's opinion overall or something new that you're doing in your course or a lab. Ongoing things like the muddiest point. You guys familiar with the muddiest point? Have you ever? I see some yeses and some blank stares. So the muddiest point is something that I usually do at the end of a class, but since I flipped my classes, I've started doing it at the beginning of class, where they can come in and drop off a note, right? And it's about the muddiest point. So what was clear as mud, right, that you would like me to talk about, right, to hopefully clarify. And so that's an easy thing to do throughout the semester. They're anonymous, at least the way I do it, so that they can feel free to complain, right, or provide, I like to call it providing insight, right? There's also informal interviews. My classes max out at about 30, and I teach labs, so it gives me a lot of opportunity, and we do a lot of active learning strategies. So it gives me a chance to both eavesdrop as well as ask students how things are going about specific things in the course. And I have literally changed things on the fly during the semester just to address things to try to make them better. And then there are my favorite, which I haven't used them in a couple of years because I've been doing some Q stuff. But I used to, when I worked on my PhD in the College of Education here, I liked their old big 3 questions, which they don't ask anymore. And I actually asked somebody at one point why they stopped that, and they said that they thought they were biased, but I use them all the time, and I think they're spun in such a positive way that they've almost always given me something, right, really valuable from students. And I do it at the end of the semester. So it's just, what did you like about this class? What did you like about the instructor? And how could this course be improved? And then, of course, there's action research, which is what I've been doing a little more of. So on those big 3 questions, I get a lot of helpful feedback. So, you know, they want to do more group work. They need more class time because even though sometimes they say they were prepared, but they got really stuck on something. Things about the lab. I actually shortened a lot of my first and second semester physics labs because one of the things that I was told was that students got stuck sometimes and they had problems finishing. That's different than complaining, right, not so helpful, that I don't like it because lab sometimes takes the entire time. Right, so it's really easy to kind of split apart the things that are useful, you know, more problem solving examples, could you do more of this and less of that, you know, more office hours, whatever. And sometimes they tell me that they just weren't prepared mathematically. I actually, now for the second time, have changed the co-requisite for the math for my physics class based on student feedback. But some things that are, they're students, so they say things like, it was too hard to get an A in here. The course is too difficult. The lab takes the whole time. You wouldn't let us turn in late homework. I missed a quiz and I came back to class a week later and you wouldn't let me make it up. I mean, you know, there's those things. So basically, during this whole time that I've been here, I was always looking for better ways of discovering students' views of my teaching and my courses. And so way back, after I finished my PhD, which had nothing to do with Q, had a lot to do with psychometrics, I discovered Q in 2004, and literally somebody who was kind of in my cohort in the graduate program, I ran into him at a conference, and he came up to me and he said, "Sue, I've been thinking about you. I took this summer course at Kent State about this methodology called Q, and all I could think of was you and all of the stuff you always complained about, student evaluation of teaching. And I think this solves your problem." And I was like, okay then, let's do a study. So we did. So I'll tell you a little bit about Q. So basically, you come up with statements, and there's a number of ways to do that, and I'll talk about it ever so briefly. There's a grid, and there's statements, and they're all on these little pieces of paper. It's really important to have a paper cutter at your disposal. I've gotten really efficient at cutting, right? And I use Excel spreadsheets so that they're all the same size, so I can, physicist, I can't help myself. And then students read each of the statements. They put them in one of 3 piles, like my view, unlike my view, and kind of neutral. They don't feel one way or another. And then they redistribute those one pile at a time into this grid. All the statements have numbers. Every box gets a number. Every number is used only once. And the idea is that it reflects their opinion. And it's very hard, right? It's not like the Likert scale surveys, which I'll talk about. I got some interesting feedback when I did my first student evaluation of teaching study. So basically, Q-sort, I won't read it to you, but it's basically self-referent, which means that they are placing these statements in the grid the way they interpret those statements and what they mean to them. That means that there's no validity and reliability concerns because it's not an external, it's not me determining what, this was a fun course means to me. It's about the student deciding what that means to them. And then they sort these statements relative to the others. so that you can tell how different ideas kind of relate to each other. And it was created by a physicist. He had a double PhD in physics and psychology, because he wanted to do something that was very big in the 1930s, which was psychophysics. Can't make this stuff up. And as Carolyn said earlier, it's basically a way of measuring subjectivity, which is opinion. It's used a lot in psychology and political science, and now more in education. And the idea is that it's very democratic in that it reveals multiple views in a group, right? And it also determines consensus. And then it provides descriptive results of each of these views. So each of these factors, because it uses factor analysis, but it's not a bad word, it's all good. Right? That each one of those factors is a qualitative, right, factor. It separates those things out. So just kind of a quick breakdown. You come up with a concourse, which is a whole bunch of statements, and they can come from literature or interviews or focus groups, or a student she's going to do her dissertation using anecdote circles. Then you pick from that concourse a Q sample, so statements that are representative of the diverse communications on the topic. Participants sort. There's magical statistics, and it groups like sorts together, and then you have these different perspectives, and the way that the software, right, what it does with the sorts basically is create these descriptive results. So you can describe, so you don't just know who goes together, but you know a lot about how they feel about your class, or, right, other things. So back to my first Q study in 2004, it was spring semester, and we used the statements from, I think we were still, might have been still the Queen Technical College then, or it might have been Summit College. We changed their name about that time. And we took the statements from that student evaluation teaching, and we had to change them a little bit, but that's basically what students sorted. And we found 3 views. We did it in multiple basic chemistry sections. And we found the self-confident student, they were going to be successful no matter what. They kind of were removed from the class. Like, basically they were going to learn stuff. It didn't matter kind of what was going on. Then the negative self, so they realized that they were to blame for their poor performance in the class. And then this other group, which we kind of called conflicted feelings. They seemed to be, right, very conflicted about how they felt about the course, right? They liked the instructor, but didn't like what the instructor did. I mean, those kinds of conflicts. And then we had a lot of student feedback that was very interesting. And so they did a lot of self-talk while they were sorting, and I walked around and eavesdropped, and I had conversations with some of the students, and because they wanted to talk to somebody. And it was funny. So, like, the one girl, she was very upset. She said, I don't like this. It's taking way too much time. And we didn't have that many statements. It was like 20 minutes. And I said, well, why don't you tell me more about that? What do you mean? We've already explained to you that, this is going to be potentially a way to better inform this instructor about the course and the lab. And she's like, I don't care about that. I'm going to be done with this class. It doesn't matter to me. She's like, I like the other way, because I can do it in, actually it was even less than, I can do it in like 3 minutes. I said, really? You can do it? You can read all those questions? And she's like, oh, I don't read the questions. I just go, I like this lady. I think I'll give her a 4. And then I just go, bubble, 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 bubble. And I give her all 4s. And I said, well, the last question, like the last statement was, I had a strong desire to take this class. I said, do you bubble that up for? She goes, oh, I didn't know that. I've never read any of the statements. She didn't read any of the statements. She just picked a number and just bubbled. It's very eye-opening, a little scary, but very eye-opening. And so one of the things I liked about using Q, besides this kind of democratic, multiple views being revealed, so I felt like I was listening to more voices than the mean. Don't have to do any psychometrics. Like I said, There's not validity and reliability is not a concern because it's internal to the sorter. And it also provides consensus. You can see where there's agreement, even where there are student views that are pretty divergent. And it helps me maintain the meaning provided by the students in their Q sorts. So I've done a lot of Q studies, but 2 more studies. One was when I taught the AY math course in the College of Education, and it was the course plus field experience. And the consensus showed that these were very pragmatic students. Like, what they agreed with was that they wanted to experience things that were going to help them when they went to student teaching, which is what they were going to do the next semester. So the idea of this course and the field experience was to prepare them for student teaching. So there were 2 views. One was the thoughtful communicators. They really wanted feedback. They wanted to talk about the readings and the projects. They really wanted to interact with others in their class and with me as the instructor. And then there was the other group that I called the practitioners, and what they wanted were activities that are active and deal directly with their future in the classroom, right? Okay, so we did readings about, education policy and how they might have to be aware of changing educational policy in the classroom and how would they deal with that in their future, opposed to dealing with just the education policy of today. So it was looking forward to like the Common Core and things like that. And they were like, oh, you don't care about those things. All I care about is what do I have to do today? I'll worry about it tomorrow another day. Okay. And then I've done actually now 2 different studies with flipping my classrooms. I flipped all my physics classrooms, my computer programming class, and and so basically the breakdown was that what students wanted were choices. What those choices were sometimes varied, but overall they wanted choices. That was something that they agreed about. And they needed structure. So I was really surprised, but one of the things that I found out, partially from the written feedback, was that even though they said they would take notes if I was presenting a regular lecture in class, it didn't occur to them to take notes when it was an online lecture. I wouldn't have thought of it. Like, how is that different? I don't know. But that was something that they were like, that, they wanted to be able to ask questions, and they got really distracted like 2 minutes into the video. They're only like 15 minutes long. I was like, well, what are you doing? Aren't you taking notes? Why would I take notes? I don't know. Would you take notes if I was lecturing in the classroom? Well, yeah. Okay. And the other big takeaway was that they really liked interacting with their peers, but I think there were 2 views, and one view liked the idea of kind of very Vygotskian social learning idea. So they felt like they learned a lot from talking to their peers and having to explain and have things explained to them. And then the other group, which I will add were not the high grade group, they liked group work and social interactions in the classroom because they felt like it was more social. And so they were very socially aware, and they liked that. So they were the ones who I was often telling them they were off task, and that they were supposed to be doing something and not talking about lunch. And some subsequent alternatives, right, besides doing Q like I've done in some other studies, and I also did some epistemology studies with my physics students who are always my guinea pigs. It's also possible to do more open-ended questions. Students, of course, like it when they're anonymous. They can be at the end of the course, which is summative. They could be the muddiest point idea. I've used clickers. I have a classroom set of clickers, so they're anonymous. They don't buy them. They're not linked directly to one person, which is nice because they can click in and I don't know. I can't say, well, Patrick, you got that wrong, right? And the same thing is true when I ask them more questions about clarity of ideas, whether or not they've actually been watching the videos, reading the book, cheating on their homework. They can answer. And so I know a little more about what's going on, and that helps me adjust accordingly. And I can do that formative, right? So ongoing. And then, of course, I always talk about, there's all kinds of other things that you can do in the scholarship of teaching and learning literature about impacting student learning and measuring student learning. Certainly, we're all about assessment. And then I just wanted to make one more comment. So things that we can do to make student evaluation of teaching less high stakes for things like RTP and merit is to list other ways of measuring or quality of teaching, right? So we have, in my department, we have teaching portfolios. We ask for additional measures by students, whether they're open-ended or muddiest point or whatever they want to do. We've done peer review. I've done peer review for people who are going up for tenure promotion, and of course we have to do external review, and there's ways to have external reviewers evaluate teaching, right? And that could even be that we provide them with videos, right, in a kind of absentee, right, peer review kind of way. So then I wanted to wrap things up by kind of turning it over to this group before we all go away. So things that your thoughts about student evaluation of teaching, patterns that you've seen related to, oh no, this is the other thing. Like these are other things, right? We reflect on student evaluation of teaching results, patterns you see, right? Course difficulty, maybe you teach a range of courses and you can see some of those things. The grading scheme, right? Certainly because I've been around a long time, I've have people go up for RTP and they have incredible student evaluation of teachings, and then you go and you look at their syllabus and you find out that 80% of their class is homework, and the students work together and they get a lot of A's, and students will tell you that that's why they gave him really high evaluation teaching at the end. And then of course gender and race. So what about you? What alternatives do you use? Do you have things in your RTP guidelines that address student evaluation of teaching biases? And I thought maybe we could talk about experiences good and bad. I also wanted to point out that AAUP has a survey, and they're looking at teaching evaluations. And it's open to anybody. You don't have to be a member of AAUP. They're looking for adjuncts and anybody to respond to their survey. It was very interesting. Of course, I'm actually always very interested in surveys and how they're laid out and weird psychometric things. But I was surprised. One of the questions on there was actually something about, do you think one way to address student evaluation of teaching is to mandate that essentially course grades have a Gaussian distribution? Like there's a percentage of A's, a percentage. I was like, wow, really? I didn't like that one. I wrote them a note. But I didn't think that solved the problem at all. But anyway, so I give it back to you guys. Yeah, Becky.
Question about gender. Gender or race of people answering the questions. If it's more subjective by definition, what are your thoughts about the impact of someone's gender as the evaluator, and how you might account for that? For example, if some of the biases you talked about were typical of, say, a male student, and most of the students in your class are male,
right?
It would look like you hadn't done very well, potentially.
Right.
They had a highly subjective way of rating a female teacher.
Right.
Did I miss something, or is that a concern that you would share?
Oh, that's definitely a concern I would share. There's been studies that showed that both female and male students tend to rate female instructors lower. Males lower than females, especially in STEM fields. It's much more difficult for women for so many things. But yeah, I mean, I always say that, not that my student evaluation teachings are horrible, but I have never gotten like our scale I think is 1 to 4. I pay so close attention. But I've never gotten like all 4. And I always say, we had a faculty person at one point her son was in mechanical engineering. He was going to transfer to mechanical engineering technology. And she called up and she asked what the demographics were of our programs. So you knew she wasn't like the average mom on the street. And we had this conversation in my hallway about that. Well, how would you describe the demographics of our program students? And somebody, a male faculty member said, I would say that they are white redneck males between the ages of 18 and 25. They own a truck. They like fishing, hunting, beer, and women, not necessarily in that order of preference. So, and at that time, I was the only, I think I may have been, no, we had 2 by then. So there were 2 out of, at that time, we had more faculty. So now we have like 10. But at the time, we had 23. And we had 2 female faculty. And I thought, well, what does that mean for us? Because that's not exactly, right, maybe what we picture as a community of students who would love the idea of like a woman teaching them physics. And usually, I'm lucky if I have one female student and 1 student of color in my class out of 30. So it's very male dominated. And I'm sure that impacts, you know, if you go up and read ratemyprofessor.com, there's some pretty funny things written about me. So I have short woman syndrome. I don't even think that's a syndrome, but I thought it was pretty funny. But yeah, and a lot of them you can just kind of, they don't necessarily come out and say it, but you kind of have a sense of gender bias in some of the things that are written. And when we used to have written responses in our old instrument, like a long time ago, there were some things where you thought, I don't know, it's at least a little misogynistic. Did I answer your question, Becky? Anybody else? Yeah, listen to it.
When you're talking about alternatives and RTP guidelines and so on, it's, I mean, something that strikes, a couple of things strike me. First of all, those of us who really care about teaching and learning frequently have those formative and alternative ways that we consistently built in and made very apparent to the class. You know, I want you to give me this feedback. I need to know how you're learning so that I can, you know, it seems to me, you know, both from some of the feedback that I get, which is usually very positive to it, but there's usually something in there, right, about that makes it pretty apparent that people see that as a sign of weakness and incompetence. Right, especially, you know, it's just, so if it's coming primarily from your female and women, and all people of color, and not across the board, it strikes me that you run the risk of reinforcing a sense of, you know, that you know, either these people are weak and they aren't very good, and that's why they're having to do this, and so it reinforces those kind of biases there, or even in a positive sense, you know, well, positive sense, reinforcing, well, you know, diverse people just care more. You know, and they should care more. And so anybody who doesn't do it then gets double slammed for not being caring enough to do what the other caregivers in the department do. So I guess I just kind of raise that as, to me, one of the reasons that you really want these to be across the board.
Right.
And, you know, it's not a good enough reason for me not to continue doing it, but I think that you then need to raise all those other flags about how it could reinforce the precise biases that we're trying to.
Right. So you're saying that basically the people who, yeah, because, well, you know, sorry, you're going to be singled out. You have one male and female, and I think that's some of the feedback actually I've gotten. So AAUP, I was one of the people who gave suggestions for rewriting Article 13, and I pushed really heavily actually about this kind of stuff. And well, I guess if as social scientists, right? Usually we talk about multiple measures, and yet And I think that that's kind of the sell, is that we need to do multiple measures about anything, especially something that's high stakes. I mean, it's kind of like, in a sense, if you wanted to give an analogy, student evaluation of teaching is kind of like saying, okay, well, we have 15 weeks, but I'm not going to have any homework to do, I'm not going to do anything. You're just going to take a test at the end of the semester and hope you do okay. Instead of having multiple measures, which is, but I can tell you that for the RTP document that we have right now, and the RTP document that we've been trying for 10 years to get approved by the higher administration, was that even at the faculty level, but as well sometimes pushback from administrators, is that they didn't want us to, they literally said, we don't want you to mandate multiple measures for quality of teaching. And that's why for our RTP, we had to make it optional. So I think we said something, I think I have language in there that says something like, we strongly suggest. But yeah, the truth is, if we've had faculty come through the RTP process who, for whatever reason, have really high student evaluation of teaching results, and they were like, I didn't want to try anything else. If you ask them, on the side, just wondering, they'll tell you, why would I have, maybe I would have gotten something negative. It's kind of the alternative. I would have gotten something negative, and then what would I do with it? If they had a negative peer evaluation or something. Yeah, Irina.
I have very different experience talking about evaluating a woman by male law. I'm teaching mathematics, calculus, so not calculus and low-level mathematics, so obviously it is a very difficult topic for students to handle, and most of them handle them good. But interesting that in my upper-level courses, like calculus 1 and 2, it heavily skewed to male population. I really have not like I'm bragging, an excellent evaluation. However, I teach another class, for example, mathematics for allied health, because mostly it's students for respiratory care or assistant, medical assistant. So when you go to this class, it's mostly very much around, mostly boys and women and very little men. And no matter what I try, the worst evaluation I got from women too. So I really have very different experience. Issue between woman and woman, it never been resolved for me. So you can see I teach 5 classes per semester, 4 of them will be A, and one class, Math for Life Health, will be all over the place. They don't like this, they don't like that, and they don't like nothing because of subject, because of me, because of woman, because of blonde, because of acting. So whatever it is,
right.
They will be all incorporated with not very good evaluation. So it's interesting that I found it issue between woman and woman rather than man and woman. That's most, and it's important for RTP. If I would teach 3 sections of mathematics for life health, I would have very not good evaluation. It would affect my promotion tremendously because, for example, my department set up certain percentage. To apply for full professor, for example, you have to have 90% of all A's in so very strict conditions. So one semester you teach some strange class more than one, you are doomed to fix it for many, many years. So that's what my strange observations and I have problem with this.
Right. Well, don't you think that, because her calculus students were my students, or are my students, and then in like the first semester of physics, we're changing it to basically pre-calc as a co-requisite. Because from some of the student feedback from doing some of this kind of action research, but don't you think part of it is too, like I'll have students, they're right now the co-requisite is Tech Math 3, and they're flunking Tech Math 3. So guess what? They're flunking physics. Guess who's to blame? I am. I make it too hard. That even though I said that the problem on the quiz was almost exactly like the problem on the test. On the quiz it was a ball, and on the test it was a rock. So they weren't the same problem. I gave you the same numbers. They were the same numbers. It was the whole thing. Like the answer's the same. Oh no. It was, one was a ball, one was a rock. Physics does not matter what the object is. Thank God. Physics would be so much harder that way. But don't you think part of it is though too? I mean, by the time they get to the calculus, we've weeded out the struggling students who really don't belong in our programs because they can't do math. And so, and then the allied health students are kind of a little more, we'll call them math focused.
I believe it's a matter of relevance to students' mathematics.
Mhm.
For example, what they do not feel that it's relevant to them, while
Absolutely.
engineering students know that they must do it, otherwise there's no way out, or even
Mhm.
they cannot be engineer. So it's many factors.
Right. Well, and sometimes they're working on the certificate in the math certificate too, the tech math certificate. So they see a lot of relevance. But we sell that pretty heavily.
That's like one factor.
Right.
Definitely.
Mhm.
I feel like if I teach calculus or something, and then next class will be that laptop, I notice for myself that I have to stop and change my personality, be a very different person, but from this class to other, otherwise it will never work. You have to be you cannot be very demanding in this class. You cannot show you do it like this. It has to be very different psychologically in this class to accomplish your result, not to low down standard, but just to make students accept you and your manner. Rather than when you teach calculus or engineering, you don't think about this, you just do it, and that's mostly their responsibility to response to my manner, not like I have to take it. A very different psychology involved. And that's, I guess,
No, absolutely.
different planets, right?
Right. But wouldn't you say none of the reaction it's not necessarily about your quality of teaching. It has to do with all these other outside factors that.
I think you have two others.
Oh,
I just want to comment because you brought up earlier, and it kind of ties in with what you were saying. You teaching a male-dominated. I'm myself a business and economics student, but I like to think one of my hobbies is physics and astronomy. Very interesting to me. That being said, I obviously enjoy it, and I understand how hard it is. So for me, sitting in your class, I wouldn't have a problem. I'm talking about myself.
Right. Yeah, because you come into the class with a very different attitude.
Exactly. I realize I'm not going to be. I'm very into math. I'm not worried about the math, but I know I'm going to need to work at it. I understand physics is terrifying. It's very hard. And I think I would have a problem coming to you for help, or realizing that you know what you're talking about. You're a woman. I don't. It doesn't bother me at all. And also, that being said, I didn't realize the significance of the student evaluations coming into this. Kind of haphazardly did it myself.
Yeah, I like her. Her for.
And then going to what she was saying, I think that is a completely logical thing. An upper level physics course, let's say I was in that, or your students, I think a lot of them will tend to feel how I do, even if they're not. They're like, okay, this is an upper level physics course. I don't care who the professor is.
Right.
And now, if it's a general physics or a general mathematics course, you're going to have some of the class that's, wow, this is no good. It's very hard, and it's going to show in your evaluations.
Right.
I think, maybe you brought that up earlier. The general education courses tend to be skewed worse, and I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, I never really thought about it until sitting here. But I think if they're that big of a indicator, which they clearly are, which that, then there should be some way to look at that between upper level evaluation and gen ed. Clearly going to be worse,
Right.
especially for some kind of something hard. Because always, if it's hard, it's going to be worse.
Right. Well, it's funny because a while ago I had a chemistry faculty person, and her husband was faculty at the College of Worcester, and then he got a different job and they moved. But we started doing something that they have to do at the College of Worcester, or at least did when she taught for me, which was like 10 or 15 years ago, which was whenever you got evaluation of teaching results that you didn't think really quite jived with what you were doing, you had to write an expletive, right, narrative about that class. Maybe there were a high percentage of people who failed. There was a very low percentage of people, like for me, maybe that class only had 25% of those students had ever had a physics class before. So we started suggesting that, kind of that same idea. So basically the faculty person could kind of tell the story of that class. I remember once I had a horrible class. It was in a horrible room. It was always too hot. We didn't have ceilings. It was not my normal kind of room. It was just a general classroom. And there was a fan that was on all the time, so I had to like yell over the fan. And it was just a dreadful room, and the students were always, it was like right after lunch, and it was probably the worst evaluation of teachings I've ever gotten. I mean, they were not below 3, but so they were okay in our college world, but I thought, oh my God, what happened? And it was before I had tenure, so I did that same thing where I wrote a narrative about that and said, all of these extenuating circumstances. Somebody else taught the first 8 weeks of that class, and I taught the second 8 weeks. He had multiple choice question tests, and I had multiple measures where I had some multiple like concept questions and some graphing and some problems, and they hated that, and they made no bones about how much they hated that. But I think that's one way to get around that kind of thing, and as well as what Irene is describing. Right. Right. Well,
Can I jump in just real quickly?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sensitive to time, and it's that we're out of time. And I know some of our students need to get to another class, and I don't want you to feel rude. On your way out, grab some fruit. Maybe if we could, the rest of the discussion, maybe we could move over there. The folks that can stay and have a little fruit or a beverage can.
There's coffee.
And coffee. We can talk about. But join me in
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Susan, did you report on the voice?